Oh, I'm Roseanne.
Wendy here.
Okay,
Hi, Wendy.
we are live. We
Oh.
can do introductions that'll come in.
Oh, no, I was just,
Okay.
I was just,
And Senator
We're
Harris is
good.
on.
I'm just being
Yeah.
nice.
Yes, absolutely. And people can introduce themselves as they ask questions. So Roseanne Greco, South Burlington Land Trust President. We're grateful to have you.
Oh, and I'm
here.
not the president, I'm just the board member.
Okay.
But thank you for promoting me. I
Okay.
always appreciate being promoted.
Does the organization not have a president?
Yes, Sarah Dopp. Okay, so Sarah Dopp is the president and founder. She
Okay.
was unable to convene
Okay.
so
Okay.
I am the spokesperson.
Okay. Okay, great. The floor is
mine?
Yes.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Roseanne Greco. I'm a resident of South Burlington, and I'm a board member of the South Burlington Land Trust, and they have authorized me to speak on their behalf. Just a sentence about the land trust.
And we have your letter.
Okay, so we are dedicated to preserving open lands, wildlife habitat, natural resources, and farmlands that make South Burlington unique. Now, normally we do not comment on housing matters, but since the Omnibus Housing Bill threatens to destroy some of South Burlington's rural lands, we wanted to make the committee aware of that. So we sent you a detailed explanation of what the bill would do and why, and some of the work that the city of South Burlington has done over the years. I'm not going to read that to you, and you're welcome. But I also, in that letter, we lay out that in addition to preserving environmental lands, the city of South Burlington has also enacted inclusionary zoning throughout our city and has mandated and incentivized housing, and especially affordable housing, in our city core areas and along public transportation lines. I believe the chair of the South Burlington City Council is going to be here and speak to you, and she'll probably give you the numbers of housing. It's in the hundreds that we have. So South Burlington preserved our open lands, at the same time got housing in our inner core. So today, I just wanted to highlight in 6 minutes or less, because I timed it, the key issues. And the bottom line is that the Omnibus Housing Bill, as it's written now, could undo some of the recent environmental protections that the city of South Burlington put in place to preserve our rural lands. And it does it because of the criteria to use municipal water and sewer as where you put housing. Right? So I just want to give a little bit of background. All right, the letter goes in detail. So we spent over 4 years of careful studies, public engagement from all sides, developers, businesses, residents, landowners, and South Burlington, after that process, identified the rural land parcels that had the most valuable natural resources. And I'll show you a picture of that, a map of that later, that should be protected from housing. It was only after that long process that the South Burlington City Council enacted new environmental protection regulations that went into our land development regulations. That's what we call zoning in South Burlington. So what these zoning changes will do will prevent more suburban sprawl, will reduce the destruction of our wooded areas, our meadows, our forest lands, which we think you all favor. I hope. Unfortunately, there are some unintended negative consequences in the Omnibus Housing Bill that will undo many of those recently enacted environmental protections. And that's because of the existence of municipal water and sewer as the criteria. It's because South Burlington has water and sewer in our rural areas. Decades ago, probably without an understanding of how that prompts suburban sprawl and affects the climate crisis, the city ran water and sewer into the rural areas. And that's a reason why the suburban sprawl has been threatening our natural resource. So, as currently written, the Omnibus Housing Bill will allow development, even dense development, over the very lands that we just enacted protections for. It'll result in more suburban sprawl, and it'll destroy more of our natural resources. Moreover, it hinders Vermont's chances of reaching your climate goals to reduce greenhouse gases, because the open lands, the trees, the vegetation, the soils, as you all know, they absorb and they store carbon. So the more we get rid of those, the less they'll be able to store the carbon, and they'll release the stuff they're storing now. So what we see is, paradoxically, this well-intended bill may do just the opposite of what it's intended. You're going to force or direct housing on rural lands, at least in South Burlington. And for Vermont cities, towns, and villages that don't have water and sewer in their core, it will do nothing to direct housing in the inner core, which is what we think you want to do. So in closing, I want to remind you, as you all know, of the necessity of preserving our open and natural resource lands in light of the climate crisis. Environmental destruction worldwide and in Vermont is a key factor in the climate crisis. Saving our natural lands is essential to mitigating climate change impacts and preventing further climate disasters. So nature, with the resources she provides us, is our only hope of meeting Vermont's climate goals, but more importantly, to ensure future generations are able to withstand and survive the climate crisis. The South Burlington Land Trust believes we have a moral obligation to address the climate crisis and do whatever we can to mitigate it. And preserving nature and our open lands is an essential part of that imperative. So therefore, we are requesting you to remove the provision of municipal water and sewer as the criteria for housing location and replace it with location, which means in the inner core and not in our rural lands. So thank you for listening. And I can show you very quickly, and I can pass it around if you want it. So this is one of the many studies we did over the past years, but all of the boxes in red, those were the parcels. The city looked at 189 parcels and singled out only 25 that rose to the very top. So you'll see those. And this map doesn't have it, other maps have it where the water and sewer lines are, and they're right along those areas. So the parcels that we just protected would be in jeopardy, as well as the land, much of the green you see on here, which is called natural resource protection. This is our zoning map that the city put in place decades ago. Unfortunately, there are water lines right next to them. And so they do allow housing, very, very limited housing, but your bill will require 5 units per acre, and that would pretty much destroy the natural protection zones. So, and then there's also habitat blocks, forest fragment blocks. So picture's worth 1,000 words if you want to take a look at it.
We might recommend to your city they not line things in red that they want to delineate. That's not a great idea. Senator Clarkson.
Oh.
So we drive, not all of that is in smart growth, designated smart growth areas or designated downtowns or village centers. So the they go hand in glove.
Right.
So it's not just that.
Oh, no, not just, no. Yes.
So criteria is not just simply municipal water and sewer. They have to be in designated downtowns and village centers or smart growth areas. So that's the intent of the bill.
Okay.
And also anything that's preserved is preserved.
Oh.
I mean, that's a given. I mean, we can't undo what has already been preserved.
Okay, if
there are covenants and protections, and if it's legally preserved,
well, we don't think
they're not legally.
They're not legally preserved. They're just zoned, so they're not conserved as in a conservation easement. They are just zoned.
It's a city full of lawyers. I'm shocked.
I am too. We've been trying to conserve them for a long time, but no, they're not conserved. That's the.
But the land trust would have a role in actual conservation. I would imagine you have conserved some.
So the South Burlington Land Trust advocates for conservation easements and partnerships whereby the land would be protected legally. We don't have very much of that in South Burlington, unfortunately. We've been trying to put a legal thing in place for something called the Wheeler property for, I think, 10 years.
So if it's legally preserved, it's legally preserved, and this bill would not impact it. I don't believe, and we can have Ledge Council confirm that. And our objective is really to focus not just water and sewer, because there are lots of places where water and sewer are that we're clear are not areas we want to have housing. We don't want to invest in further density necessarily. So it really has to be that confluence of downtown village center, designated smart growth area with water and sewer.
Is that a recent change, Senator? Because
that is our intent. So it's,
I know that.
I mean, that's our intent. So yes. this is just a first draft, we're just getting there, but that's the intent that we've articulated
Right.
it very clearly.
We're in agreement, because that's exactly what we want as well. It's just as the language right now doesn't say that.
Well,
I think I tried to mention to your city council, et cetera, that we're working on the language around municipal water and sewer to make some clear delineations. Legally protected areas are different than, areas that have been zoned in the local community. So that will be a conversation and a question mark right now. So neither of you are wrong, but that's an open question we're trying to answer this week. Senator Brock.
Well, as I look through the document that you passed around to us, the parcels that are marked are those that are zoned or plan to be zoned by your zoning committee, rather than anything that is legally conserved otherwise.
Correct, they are not legally.
So there's no legal preservation.
There's no legal preservation. That's the rub.
next step. That is the next step.
That's the rub, yes. And it's because they're, in most cases, they're owned by individuals, right? And we had a lot of animated discussions when we were doing the environmental protections, because some people who own their lands were concerned that they wouldn't have the ability to have big developments on them. So we compromised. But yes, those are just the identified parcels, but they're not protected. And we just, as I was saying, and if you read and I'm sure Chair really will maybe explain it in more detail, is that we put the zoning in place. It didn't prohibit housing, but dramatically reduced it on lands that we identified that had, key natural resources. And so there is some, but the bill would now require pretty dense housing on areas that we didn't want to touch because of the wildlife habitat, the natural resources, the riparian areas, the tree covers, etc.
So when you say didn't want to touch, that can look different than allowing low density housing
We did.
on that land. So
We did.
the difference here is allowing low density housing versus slightly higher density housing. What is the environmental consequence of low density housing for climate change versus
Sure.
slightly higher density
Yeah.
housing when you have some of the fastest growing employers in your community?
It's significant.
No,
Yeah.
actually, you probably would do planned unit development. You
we had
would
that.
cluster
I
it
did have that.
as high density and the rest of it would be preserved.
That's what we did.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So
that's
you
what we
would,
did.
yeah.
That's our conservation PUD.
Yeah.
And that was a compromise. Yeah, right. But we did that. But this would allow, the way this is written though, it would allow much more housing on the smaller parcels of land, which would, there are, the closer you get to riparian areas and wetlands and stuff, the more impact you have on them. So it was a compromise to not have, 12-story apartment buildings next to a wetland because of the runoff and all the damage that might do. So
But to allow a large square footage, single family home.
no, they're not written like that.
Okay.
And I think when Helen and Paul Connor, who's our director of planning and zoning, they'll if you want the detail, they'll go into the detail about what the kinds of houses are, and they're not McMansions kind of thing. We didn't want that. We wanted smaller units clustered together on a certain proportion of the land that had natural resources over the entire land. But we were trying to get the landowner, if they choose it, this is a choice. If they choose it, they would preserve the most valuable natural resources and then cluster the houses in the areas that are further away from the natural resources. The problem is this bill upsets that. I hope what you say is,
So it's a choice. Is it a choice?
Yes, a landowner has a choice to, if they want to develop their land, meaning more fully develop their land. They can, and their land has been identified that it has natural resources, and we hired Arrowwood, I mean, we had our other experts to identify that. They have a choice if they want to do it. They have to save part of their land and they can develop the other part of it. They don't have to do that if they don't want to.
What's the other choice?
And that's what Paul will tell you, how many houses are allowed on the
Okay.
remaining. Yes,
Okay.
yeah, but yeah.
So it sounds like there's a base zoning that is relatively undense, right? Low density. And then
Yeah.
if the owner wants to, they can do a PUD where they probably get more
More.
total units if they
Correct.
concentrate the units.
That's right, that's right.
So knowing those densities would be really helpful for
And
us.
Paul will, so we're not the housing people, we're the environment people. So Paul Connor is the zoning expert, and so he'll have all of those figures, and I'll talk to him afterwards, so I'll make sure he brings them, so you know exactly what the density is and what the various zones are, and potentially what the bill might do
Right.
to that.
Because the 5 units per acre isn't really that high of a density. So you may
It's
already
very
have
low.
something.
I think it's four is what we have.
All right, yeah,
I'll let-
so your base density may be pretty close. to
I will
what
let
we're
him
talking
speak to
about.
that. I don't want, zoning is not my area of
Okay.
expertise.
Right.
Um,
And then
so-
just to put a fine point on that, the only difference is, 5 units per acre is considered fairly low density. Being able to do it as a triplex and a duplex instead of 5 single-family homes, some would argue can be better for the footprint and the environment, and that's what this bill would allow.
But Senator, this only is applicable to what we're talking about as a conservation PUD. The other unintended consequences of those big natural lands that we identified years ago, and they're in green.
And they're
And
owned
they-
by other people.
Most of them are privately owned, but
Okay.
these are not zoned. These are off limits to conservation PUDs because of the natural resources. So they remain very, very low density. This would upend that. And these protections have been in existence because there's wildlife habitats all the way through here, and other natural resources. And the water runs right through there. So these are the ones we're concerned about, all of our natural resource lands because they're so valuable. But this would just sort of overturn what South Burlington has been trying to do for the decades, and in wisely, choosing what lands to preserve and what lands to develop. I think, as I said in my letter, I think South Burlington's a model for this. We did our homework. We hired outside experts. We heard from all sides, and we put together a plan that protects our natural resources and at the same time incentivize housing, mostly affordable housing in the inner core. This is not the inner core. Anybody that lives in the southeast quadrant, where most of this is, has to have a car. There's no public transportation. There's no amenities. There's nothing there except housing clusters, and some of them pretty mammoth housing clusters. So you're driving, people are forced to have a car to get any place. Housing needs to be here where they can walk to all the city amenities, the doctors, the grocery store, the library, etc., or get on a bus. Nothing exists down there. And so what the bill would do is, if it requires housing here, is you're going to put more suburban sprawl. And that's what
Which you
we're
already
trying to
have.
stop.
You
We
already
got-
have significant amounts of
Yes,
that.
we do, ma'am, and
And
we apologize
We're
for
not gonna
that.
insult South Burlington. Beautiful community.
Well, but I regularly stay at a condominium that is right on one of your purple preserved places. So you already have a lot of high density coexisting
Yes.
with some of the areas you're wanting
We
to
do.
preserve.
We do.
And Yeah.
Sadly, we do.
so we're out of time. We
Oh.
appreciate this. Thank you for coming all the way down here. I don't try to have the last word, but a lot of the further out green areas you talked about don't look like they're on water and sewer lines. So,
Well, it depends on what you say on lines, how far. I mean,
okay.
Some of it
So
is,
that's a clear definitional issue that we're,
right. So
we're
the natural
working on.
resource ones, yes.
yeah.
But the high value parcels that we just identified,
Mhm.
they are,
And they
on
have
water.
low density housing now.
they have, well, yes, they do.
I think, I mean, the real
Yeah.
thrust of the bill is that you know, if you have one house per 10 acres, you can have that, but you have to pay the value of that. It can't be zoned so that it's exclusive of higher density, if that's possible, and you have the capacity.
Yeah, I guess our South Burlington is that density belongs in the inner core, not on the rural lands, right? We don't want density in the rural lands because that's not affordable, because you have to have a car and it affects
People
the
also
climate.
have a car to live far outside of South Burlington and drive
Well,
into South Burlington
Right,
for work.
right, but, okay, I'm here to speak on behalf of the environment, so I'm sure the city will talk about that. But the more we destroy our natural environment with housing, future generations are going to suffer as a result, because those trees, those grasses, the wildlife, they all provide us what we need to live. And in the climate crisis, we need way more of that. Any of the reports you read say that preserving nature is essential. If we're ever going to be able to reduce our greenhouse gases, and building more houses over meadows is doubly harmful, because you're adding more fossil fuels, you're adding more greenhouse gases, and you're removing the land areas that were helping us by absorbing them. So that's what the South Burlington Land Trust is trying to convey to you. The city will talk about the zoning.
Right.
We're just trying to get you, hopefully,
We're
we all
pretty hip.
agree.
We're pretty hip.
I think you are, yes.
And many of us are fighting very hard. This is already a very developed town. Many of us are fighting to balance the density development that we're talking here with protecting much more fragmented forestry
I understand.
outside. You already are a very developed.
And we want to stop. I mean, don't sacrifice the rest of our rural
No,
lands.
no. I
We
mean,
want to keep our bobcats and our coyotes, and our birds. We don't want to
probably
lose
will.
them. So,
yeah, but thank you for all your work in South Burlington.
Very helpful to
Thanks for
understand.
Really great.
okay, I'm pretty passionate.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
We've appreciated your passion in many other ways.
Yes. I fail a lot, but I keep trying.
No, you do wonderfully.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ellen, for your patience and your back and forth. Okay. All right, discussion. So we don't have to answer the question about emergency shelters right now in section 3. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add. We also actually, it looks like we have folks who might, sorry, I want to take a moment to see who our guests are. And is it for Mental Health Day?
We're here for the Vermont Leadership Institute.
Oh, great.
For
Okay.
what?
Yeah,
Sorry, for what?
For the what? The Vermont Leadership Institute.
Oh, you're being,
Yeah.
right.
I just look at Will and I think I missed like a day in the state house, that's important to recovery.
Yeah, that's on the 15th.
Okay, so you're just
Right, so you're here,
emerging
for-
leader.
you're here for today and tomorrow, right? You're
That's right.
spending tonight at the Capitol Plaza.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes,
Well,
that's why so few rooms are
we were returning to a section of the bill where I just wanted to see if Ellen or Ledge Council has any thoughts before we just think outside of the committee about location and emergency shelter, and if in the subsection around daily or seasonal operations, that might also be where we put something about intended functional use related to location.
Sure. Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. Yes, I think potentially you could build some additional language in there. So just to take a step back, already in this bill, you're working in 4414 and 4412, which are the sections in chapter 117 that restrict and that define what towns can put in their zoning. And 4413 is one of the most narrow provisions that currently exist. And so as you can see on page 4, it limits the different parameters that a town can use. So it's a much more restricted list, but location is on that list. So potentially you could add an additional carve out for those facilities. And dictate I hadn't thought about putting it specifically for intended functional use, but that might make sense depending on how you want to define it.
Right, I think it would leave a little bit more flexibility to say, it's becomes more obvious what the intended functional use is, and it loses functionality if you regulate the location outside of an area that people couldn't get to. If that makes sense, but that could still be too vague, so I'll keep thinking about it.
Just a question on that line. Do you want these other items to be able to be regulated with respect to location? Because it seems like these are necessary things that folks might not want next to them, right? That's what these uses are.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering if any of them should be located or should be regulated. If
Hazardous
the town
waste
should
facilities.
be able to
Yeah.
Well, so
regulate by location.
the town can't prohibit these structures, but they are allowed to define districts where these structures can be.
Okay.
So this is a very old statute. That is, you could make that policy decision potentially.
I mean, I don't
Fine.
really want
Good
to
luck.
because that's out of our purview,
Right.
but I'm just curious
Yeah.
if this would be the only exemption,
Mm.
if we start going down that
Yeah.
route.
Mhm.
And
Well, there are a
I
lot of-
don't think we really do want to, I don't know. It's up to you guys.
Yeah,
We've
no,
done
it's,
this
I mean,
before.
it's a fair point. I think, but it might get us into too much complexity because I think hazardous waste, then
Yeah,
we'd be a bit subjective. Although a lot of this is under the purview of the two committees that are gonna look at the bill, us and natural resources. So I guess as we're just thinking about this section and talking to others, that's a fair question as well.
And so just go back to what I was saying, because it wasn't a fully fleshed out thought. If you look at the bottom of page 4, so there's that list in
Mhm.
sub A, and then the final sentence starting on line 17 is, and only to the extent that the regulations do not have the effect of interfering with intended functional use. So it's that list plus are the limitations in this list not interfering with the functional use? So that's already built in, which is why this is
Oh, I
sort of a
see.
special list.
Right.
And in regards to the hours of operation, that's why I drafted it to specifically call out that the hours of operation
I
are
see what you're
part of the
saying.
functional
Yeah.
use.
So that's the big change we're getting here for emergency shelters.
Yeah.
I think I'm still stuck on the location.
well, so maybe the town wouldn't be able to just say, we don't want it there unless there was a really good reason. Because that would interfere with the intended functional use, because people need to be able to walk to it by definition, pretty much, right?
Right, someone would then have to make that argument.
Yeah.
Someone developing a shelter would then have to make that
Mhm.
argument.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That you're interfering with it. So it's kind of, now that it's in the list,
Yeah.
it shouldn't interfere with intended functional use even by location.
Yeah.
So it could be, so then I'll just double check that feels like enough for the situations that AHS brought up they're currently facing.
Yeah, you may want to hear from them. I think that
Mhm.
in developing this section, other sections were considered, and I do think more protection, they would argue would be better, but it
Mhm.
does get more complicated if you the more you move away from this,
Got it.
defining its own category. So I do think we could probably come up with additional language, but,
Yeah, I think we've just heard of all the acute elements of our housing crisis, homelessness is quite acute, so
Being second in the
this is our
country.
one section that, deals with
but
emergency,
do
full
we-
emergency shelter.
We had St. Johnsbury.
Yes, that was the example.
Yeah. Is that the exception that proves the rule?
I have heard this anecdotally in Burlington. People, they've looked long and hard for a location for a warming shelter. And at first the churches had to do it because they couldn't be regulated. The same way, so a lot of people end up in church basements when,
Yeah,
There
that's
isn't
where
enough.
they are. Well, now another way is doing it.
right.
But
I'm not wedded to any changes. I just don't want to lose track of this.
So I guess I just need to take a step back. This is, this section is saying to towns that they can only be regulated with respect to these limited aspects of a development. Other than that, they cannot regulate them. So we would be adding emergency shelters to something that they could regulate with these things: noise, lighting, traffic, location. Right? We'd be adding emergency shelters as one of those things.
Yes.
And we would be adding, which I think, and I may be crazy, but I thought that was a little redundant with the first set of criteria and in lines 14 through 18. Isn't that a little redundant, or should we just expand it?
Well, I think it's making it extra clear that they already have to be careful about these other issues, but well, the interesting thing is, I suppose maybe a hazardous or solid waste facility or a hospital might also have you can't regulate their hours, but that hasn't necessarily come up. It's come up a lot with specifically to emergency shelters.
Yes.
That we want to say explicitly, telling them they can only operate 4 hours a day, or 1 month of the
Is that
year
realistic?
would make it hard for them to meet their need.
Great, so I'll just add that in the past, and I don't have an exhaustive list of this, but I think that sometimes towns will regulate hours of operation through the traffic or noise criteria.
Yeah.
So they're allowed to regulate based on traffic and noise, and sometimes they will put hours of operation on a business in order to mitigate those impacts. So this is just further, the language that's on page 5 is to further clarify that specifically for these shelters, regulating their hours of operation is part of their functional use.
Mhm.
So they
Daily
can-
or seasonally.
Yes.
Yeah. I just think that hasn't had to be as explicit, because people know,
Right.
what the others need to do to operate. So we will keep thinking about this. Section 4, we're looking at that too. Oh, yeah. Are you
So
ready?
sorry, I mean, we clearly had testimony about the importance of this from the emergency shelter community.
Mhm.
We haven't heard from towns about pushback on this, have we?
VLCT mentioned this section. They wanted to better define emergency shelters. So there is a group outside of committee talking about because both Vermont Legal Aid and VLCT mentioned hotels and motels and some of the definitions. So there is already work happening.
Okay.
Not with me, I don't.
No,
No,
I'm sorry, I'm
good,
putting in this
good,
section. I was like, the cafeteria is also this way. So that's my mental go-to. But yeah, there's Maura is helping make sure those stakeholders stay in communication about some of the concerns we did here. And VLCT, did say that town had the question.
And then just so to be, there was also a concern about supportive services being nearby.
Mhm,
That
exactly.
could be a
Yeah, that could be the nexus.
challenge.
Right. Co-locations, okay. Section 4. So in section 4, as people are reading it, it has more of the definitions, and that's, I think, where we would put, is that where we would put 2-unit dwellings?
Yeah, I think that you've heard, I think what I've heard is that you're interested in getting rid of the duplex definition, which I think makes sense. And then striking that second sentence. So changing 2-unit or duplex, just switching duplex to 2-unit, and then striking that sentence about allowing ADUs on duplexes.
So Senator Cummings, that's where it appears. We haven't gotten to it yet, but that sentence would come out. Okay, that's what I call the Rube Goldberg
So what are we calling them? 2-unit?
dwelling.
Which, it must be said, could be what we think of as a duplex and what we think of as a dwelling with a ADU inside the house,
Mhm.
inside the walls.
Inside, not detached.
That,
Okay,
I
so-
believe 2-unit dwelling would cover both of those.
So no, I'm hesitant to say that because technically ADU has its own specific definition.
Mhm.
So
I'm not getting-
if a house has an ADU within it, it potentially could qualify as both an ADU or a duplex. But this does maintain separate definitions, and ADUs have the owner occupied requirement. So
And the
yes.
why do I keep saying that?
Subordinate.
Subordinate.
So is there a fuller definition that we could employ here that clarifies that they need to be a proportional size? So that, generally duplexes are almost exactly the same. So in England, every semi-detached, they're pretty much exactly the same square footage. They're pretty much, and they're just joined by a wall. Is there something we could add that would clarify the expectation that they're similar size?
is that what you wanted to say? I thought you didn't want it to say that.
We
Well,
don't want it to say it constitutes now a single unit dwelling, and I don't know what we wanted to say. Now, if we take out the second sentence, duplex is simply defined in statute, as I understand it, as 2 dwelling units in the same building. We could, if we further define ADU, does that maintain the separation of how it's considered from a duplex?
I don't know. I think the expectation with a duplex is that they're of equitable size, that they're similar in size. Whereas when you take away and call it 2-unit dwelling, there's a different expectation, even though you don't have it defined.
It's not subordinate.
It's not
I don't know what-
subordinate.
Not necessarily subordinate,
Mhm.
it could be
A
subordinate.
duplex. Or
That's
two,
what I'm saying. If it's
Yep,
a
but-
2-unit dwelling, it could be subordinate.
a
but-
2-unit dwelling could either be a duplex or an ADU. Or
Or neither.
Correct.
or neither. What else would
Right.
it be?
So ADU has very specific limitations on
Yeah.
it as being 30% of the unit
Right.
or less.
Yeah.
And so you could have plenty of other, I think, different combinations.
60-40,
Yeah,
55-45.
yeah. I guess those are probably,
So maybe we could
But-
just clarify that it needs to be more than 30%. We could,
More than a.
I just think
yeah.
there is an expectation, and I may be wrong, but having grown up in a city with lots of duplexes, there is an expectation about duplexes that they are of equitable size, either side by side or top to bottom.
so I thought that we just said a moment ago that we're getting rid of the word duplex.
I know, but the expectation, we're just changing the words. The expectation is still that these are going to be 2 full family units.
I think, no, so there is some confusion, but I think it's all around. I took on board from the planners or Chip or whoever, that we might want to have let towns more broadly define 2 dwelling units, but that we would maintain definitions for duplex and ADU in our statute. And the purpose of each would still, I think we're moving toward agreement on duplexing by right and ADUs that have more restrictions because they were designed and considered for another purpose.
So if we're getting rid of then maybe if we're investing further in duplex by right, then we shouldn't get rid of our using duplex here.
So that is sort of what I'm trying to ask. So this definition is being added because in section 2, duplex is being used in 2 different places. It's the duplexes anywhere, and then there's a couple of references to making sure that the town doesn't put additional restrictions on duplexes that aren't on single family.
Right.
So perhaps it would be more useful to work backwards from what's in those and what you intend to mean. Because if you intend that by right to only apply to units that are the same size, then you'd want that in the definition. But if you're talking about any building that has just 2 units in it,
Right. Because do we have more, what we're thinking about with the kind of like way that ADUs would be separately regulated, would that then constitute regulating them differently than a single unit dwelling versus how we would allow more rights for a duplex, which I think we're saying, okay, that's more roughly equal size, it's roughly equal living space because it's beyond 30% of, because it's beyond a 70-30 split somewhere on the
Yeah.
continuum.
So I will say there is language in this bill, in the ADU statute, that is further saying that ADUs should be treated the same as single family units.
Okay.
So you're
because we also made
mostly
those that
lining
way.
them up.
Yeah.
But if there is a distinction, you do want to make sure that that's being expressed.
Okay.
So everywhere that you look up the definition of duplex, it is very much at sort of equal size. I mean, it says, a duplex is a multifamily home that has 2 units in the same building. Every photograph has 2 units that are pretty much mirror images of each other. But the floor plan can vary. Units can be arranged either side by side or stacked one on top of each other, each occupying an entire floor or 2 of the building. So to me, there is an expectation of duplex, which is very different from just 2 units. And
Where was that?
it's the definite, it's a,
No, I mean, it's like Wikipedia or?
no, yeah,
Well, there are a whole bunch of definitions.
Yeah.
Some of the definitions hold pictures, some don't. But the most common one, the most common general definition of a duplex in most of the US is 2 separate single-family units in one building on a single lot with separate entrances for.
right.
Mhm.
That's a duplex. There's nothing regarding size
Yeah,
that has to be. What if it's
Right.
2 feet different? What if it's 6 feet
Exactly.
different? Yeah.
yeah,
You
Well,
get
the
into too much
zoning is gonna
subjectivity.
cover
Yeah.
that.
Start
Right.
trying
The
to
zoning
micromanage it.
will.
right.
To me, an ADU, you said family, that's,
Yeah, it's for smaller.
all right, when you talk about this, a dwelling unit, I
Mhm.
see one person. It's a grandmother or grandparent.
Mhm.
It may or may not have a separate entrance.
Mhm.
I may be doing an ADU so that my caregiver can live in it.
Mhm.
If we get too broad, you run the risk of people moving whole poor families in and turning every bedroom
Into a
in.
subordinate.
Yeah,
unit.
it's the subordinate,
Mhm. Yeah.
if housing is in high demand and it's expensive,
Mhm.
people will do what they have to do to be housed.
Mhm.
And that may mean packing a whole lot of folks,
Mhm.
into a house or an
Right.
apartment that shouldn't be there. And I
Right.
don't think that's what we want to encourage.
No, what I think I'm hearing is that we don't necessarily want to over define duplex, but we want to make sure it's clear that a duplex is anything that's not the definition of a subordinate ADU at 30% or less of the footprint.
So maybe
we can accomplish that.
Yeah, and maybe we talk about it as 40% or more, 40% or more.
Mhm.
That would make
Over
sense. Then you could
30%.
have every conceivable size.
Good-sized house.
I think ADUs are gonna evolve through the years, so we might
Yeah.
wanna just be more flexible and not put in definitions that are gonna need to be changed in a couple of
We
years.
do have the definition at 30% now.
It's already there. We
So-
expanded it to 900 square feet but it's all, key is being subordinate to the main.
Right.
Right,
Structure.
which is very specific.
Yeah, it is. That's why it
Not
is.
necessarily in the same building,
Mhm.
because the term duplex means generally the definition is in the same building.
Right.
Right.
That's almost the distinction.
It's the same.
Under the same roof.
Right, but people have, I mean, I don't know how much this is happening, but people have raised concerns that I think our definition takes care of right now, that like, what if you build a huge new house on your lot and you make your previous house your ADU?
Well,
you know?
I'm just thinking, given the square footage of my house,
Yeah.
I could build a nice,
900
lot.
square foot.
I could build a nice little square foot house in my backyard.
Yeah,
Which if I just wanted to subdivide and put a house back there,
You could do that.
no, I couldn't, because it doesn't have road access, it's a swamp back there.
Well. then
But
you
I,
could-
so I, but I think, I would say maybe that is what we're trying to
Yeah.
achieve, is that people can start adding a little extra unit that, you know, that creates more infill where we want it, because it's existing.
I'm not sure I
land.
want it in my
Okay, well, maybe
house.
you have a very nice house, Ann, but I don't know about your backyard, so.
My backyard is swampy. It's the drainage
So where does this
area.
get
It's
us?
a water feature.
It's a water feature.
So I'm not sure. I think I'm striking the word duplex and making it 2-unit.
2-unit dwelling.
Yes, because, and I just want to go back. So the other definition of ADU is owner occupied. So that's the other aspect. is
Yeah.
No matter what size the 2 units are, it could still be a 2-unit dwelling because nobody lives there that owns it, right? Those are primarily rental properties.
Right.
So that's the other thing.
Yeah. What the planners came to us and said, I think, was we need, if you're saying duplexing by right, we need to know what that means as opposed to an ADU. So maybe the 2-unit thing is a red herring now, I don't know, but
I would stick, I mean, I hate to be a thorn in the
Yeah.
side here. I would stick to duplex. If we have duplex by right, I would hang more on duplex and get it, and not complicate it with 2
Yeah.
units. I mean, I just hate to say it, but
But based on what you said a minute ago, I think the opposite is true, because you just said that based on like colloquial understanding, those are, a duplex is equal sized units. And if that is your intent, that by right, the units have to be of equal size, that's probably not what you want.
no, I think we looked at definitions that it's kind of understood, but they might be different, you know,
One
some
could
are a
have
second
3
floor
and
where
one
there's
could
like a
have one
balcony and
bedroom.
it's like.
Right.
I mean,
so you
Yeah.
go to the definition of duplex, and it doesn't say anything about equal size.
Right,
2 dwelling
That's
units
what I-
excluding ADUs, which
Right.
are something else, like
well,
that's.
they are smaller, they're
Okay.
subordinate to a main unit.
Right.
And I think if they are just, we're looking at them as, I could have my caregiver or my kid live in it
Mm-hmm.
and charge rent, or provide rent. But I would keep the owner occupied. Otherwise, I'm just thinking of the apartment buildings that are getting bought
Mm-hmm.
and rented out as B&Bs or Airbnbs. I don't want to start investors. I gather there's at least one couple that are now very wealthy from buying up houses in ski areas in the southern part of the state and renting them out as Airbnbs. I don't know that I want to encourage that. And if I say you can have an accessory dwelling unit and, oh, by the way, you don't have to live there, well then, and can I have 2 accessory dwelling units?
some towns allow that, but the statute, only
Okay,
allows
so
it to one.
I can rent out a room in the basement and a room in the attic, and then I can rent out the main floor on a weekly kind of deal. And I'm not sure we want to encourage that at this point.
So I think I'm still hearing the same thing, which is that's, you know, a duplex we know just has more living space. And so a duplex is defined as
A
not
single
an,
family.
not an ADU. An ADU has a more specific definition that maintains owner occupancy.
So.
Yeah.
I think to help Ellen, as
Yeah.
we draft
Yeah.
this, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
I think, just from this conversation, I would keep duplex.
Okay.
And,
Okay.
and I think particularly if we're hanging a lot on duplex by right. I think
So
that
du- yeah.
consistency, Catherine, I go back to what Catherine's testimony was.
Mhm.
Consistency of language is helpful for planners,
Mhm.
and consistency, period, is useful.
So we will
Parenting.
take out 2-unit dwelling. And to be fair, I think Chip was more responding to the duplex plus the ADU thing that we have
Yeah.
stricken, because that I think was very complicated. It's like, is that a 4-unit building then, or is that a That's a lot.
I think you're right. I think.
So I think now we've like solved.
Yeah,
that.
and you start doing that in dense areas.
Right.
I get a permit to build a duplex. Well, then I turn an accessory dwelling unit, which requires another bathroom, which is how you determine your water and sewer, or a bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
That can impact the water and sewer capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's done on bedrooms, not baths. So if I add a bedroom on, then if I've already got a duplex in an area that was formerly single family
Mm-hmm.
or is single family, and then I add an accessory dwelling unit, I'm on that same square footage where normally I would have had one house. I now have 4 living units, which is 4 times the flushes of normal.
Mm-hmm.
Which is not what we're
Mm-hmm.
wanting.
Well, it would further limit your ability to put in housing, or could give a reason to not put it in.
That's a good point.
So the town would still have authority over that.
Right.
Yes,
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
but I don't think we want to aggravate it by saying, all right, town, you have to let a duplex in. And then, oh, by the way, that duplex can add on an accessory dwelling unit.
Mm-hmm.
It's-
Yeah, I think we already agreed to not do
Yeah.
that. So
Right.
let's,
But we might want some other way to get to the 5 units an acre is one thing, but then just so I'm clear, is the owner occupancy a requirement? Is that if the ADU is rented?
that's if the ADU uses state and federal money to develop the ADU.
Okay, so if someone
That's what Ellen
does
was
it
clarifying for us. Towns can now regulate.
privately,
Yeah.
Yeah, privately,
There's
people
no-
could develop an
Unless
ADU
their
right now.
town restricts it.
Right, yeah. So the statute exists independent of VHIP,
Mhm.
right? So towns, prior to the adoption of the ADU statute, could prohibit additional living space.
Right.
And so because that's there, the towns have to allow it, whether they're renting to a private individual or a
Mhm.
relative, they have to allow it.
So this is currently by right, ADUs exist by right now.
Yeah.
But the bigger towns, Brattleboro and Burlington, I think both have the owner occupation requirement. And I just want to, so there's no, maybe this is more confusing, but I think the working group's intent was to get rid of owner occupation. And we've heard a strong
I feel.
reason to keep it, and that's, fine for ADUs. So the question then becomes, do we want to is there anything we want to talk to a real estate lawyer about in terms of, is that a huge encumbrance? That it's permanent, you create a $50,000 a separate entrance, partition of the home, you're an older person, you want the income, you want to stay there, you want someone to live with you. But what in the real estate world does that tell us it does to the person when they go to sell it or their kids inherit it and they don't want to live there?
but it's
We're just
only
asking that question.
if the ADU is rented.
No,
The ADU.
no.
No,
Okay, that's what I've been
if
trying
you
to figure.
sold
Okay.
that building, then we would still have to have the owner live there.
But there are a lot of people for whom that's, a way they can afford to buy the house. is
Right.
there
No,
as a
no,
rental
I
unit.
understand, but
But
And the whole issue is, do you create permanent encumbrance on something that's not owned by the person who started the ADU chain in the
Yes.
first place,
Right.
to go on in perpetuity? And I don't think. you
And that's
do.
kind of what the New York
No, I
Times
mean,
is
if I
saying.
buy
Like,
that
that's why some people are
house
doing that.
and somebody's renting the back ADU, unless
If they have
there's a
that's
lease.
one
Yeah, I
situation,
just
but if
wanted to
there's no
make sure.
lease,
If,
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
I mean, but
encumbrance.
it only goes for the term of the lease.
but that's not what we're discussing.
No.
Or
But
you're saying-
that's it. I mean, once it's sold, I can say, I want to put a game room back there. And I can turn my ADU back in to,
Well, but
This
the issue
bedroom.
is, if you buy the house, if
Right,
you're the
right.
new owner of the house, and you decide that you want to continue renting, but you want to rent to someone else, and then you don't want to live there yourself, there's an encumbrance
yes,
that
there is.
prohibits you from doing that. in perpetuity, and I don't think that makes
Well,
sense.
if you took,
Well, so we're gonna talk to the
Yeah,
lawyer, and we
yeah.
can chat about all those things with the lawyer.
Okay.
But for Ellen's purpose, we are through with section 2, I think.
That was 4. That was 4 because it was related to section 2.
Oh, okay. So is there
I was
anything
gonna-
else we would add to the definition of duplex before we leave? Or do you think we're okay?
I think so, not an ADU. is
Not
what
an
I'm
Not an
hearing.
ADU,
Yeah.
okay. Okay, let's clarify that.
And not
then
an
I think we're
apartment.
in good shape.
That apart,
Sorry. what
that's,
was
that
it? What
gets
did you-
beyond, that's a multi-unit dwelling. That has a separate definition.
I mean, to me, a duplex is closer to a full-size home
Yes,
than an apartment.
yes.
I
Unless
don't
it's on a postage stamp.
Okay. Do we want to preview, Wendy? I know you might, I think you remember better in section 5, some of the things we might want to look at. Bylaw reporting
Oh, the information.
and review before adoption.
Let me find it.
Yep, so this section requires that when the towns update their bylaws, they're already required to report to DHCD, but this is adding additional information that they need to provide in that report.
So, sorry, this is section 5.
Yes.
We're getting like a preview before new.
Right, so do you want me to just go over the suggestions that I have on this?
Yes, yeah, because I honestly didn't remember the concrete suggestion.
Right, the concrete suggestions I had were actually in a separate section,
Oh, okay.
but generally, what my, just in just for my
Yeah.
opinion, I think that there needs to be some flexibility in terms of the towns having to input information into the state database. And I think there's a reasonable case to be made that the town should be able to transmit the information and then the state input the information so that it's inputted correctly and it's also a burden to put on towns.
So I think this is gonna get to the crux of data collection, because this is like the zoning atlas. This might be, Maura's gonna come in and talk about where we might look at existing data requirements and add to them. She was mentioning that the landlord certificate already asks for a majority of things we're looking for about what a rental is, where she's gonna try and get air DNA information out to our planning commissions. But the nexus right now is that some zoning atlas exists, some data repository system exists. You're saying,
Or we need to create.
right, you're saying they should be able to give it in a way that is possible for them, and the state should be able to do cleanup to
Yes,
meet the needs of smaller towns.
I think some towns don't have this capacity.
Yeah, I'd say
Okay.
that we need to remember that not all towns are Chittenden County.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah,
right.
frequently, there's just 3 select board members and an elected clerk treasurer.
And even if there's hired staff, it can be
Yeah,
really
it can be
challenging.
really
right.
challenging.
So they're making a good faith effort to get this information, but it has, I mean, which I think kind of exists as an informal agreement. I mean, I don't think there's a penalty if you don't get it done the right way. And so we've been operating with that kind of flexibility informally, but if there's anything you wanted to do that's more formal about saying they have technical, I mean, I think that's also where the technical assistance grant.
Right, and then I have a question probably for Ellen, if we have another minute.
Yeah, let's.
I'm not sure where it would go, but is it possible to permit the towns to use a much quicker and simpler process to update a bylaw if what the subject of the bylaw is mandated by the state? So say you have to update your bylaws for the 5 units an acre. Can towns do that in a way that's simple, maybe just pass the ordinance, because there really isn't any choice. There still should be public notice, but the public doesn't have, and the public should know about it, so they know how to respond, but the town won't be able to not update
They
that.
can't say,
don't have a
no, we
choice.
aren't doing bylaw by right. The state law is gonna say.
Right,
you
Right.
have to allow duplex by
Right.
right.
So why
So
take a
why-
year and a half?
Why take a year and a half if the law says this is what it is?
Right,
No, the only other, so currently under statute, no, except for the use of interim bylaws, which do have an abbreviated timeframe.
could we change that? Could we update that process?
People have wanted us to take on interim bylaws and interim zoning, and I haven't felt like I have.
I wouldn't do it as
Okay.
interim,
I'm just
because
seeing
this
yeah,
is just, why go
Oh,
through the
I see what you're
process for a
saying.
year and a half when you could do it in 2 months, if it's something that you have to do? And I would argue the development community might want the bylaws sooner rather than later, so
Mhm.
that they're sure that they exist before they proceed with development.
So put a timeline around.
Or just give a different establish a different process that towns could use only for bylaw changes that are absolutely required by statute.
I mean, you bylaws have to be voted on, right?
Right, yeah.
So mostly you only vote at town meeting. So if you start this in April, you're at least a year. And then what happens if the town says, no, we're not having duplexes? Then you start the process all over. If the state says, this is the state law, you must abide,
I guess
then why do you have to go, and it can cost money to
Organized.
print notices and post them in the grocery store and all that stuff.
And in this case, we want it done quickly. The state wants it, there's a benefit to the state for it to be done quickly so that those are in effect.
Something to think about.
So it's
Yeah.
after 12
Yeah.
We don't want to run.
Yeah.
and
Our committee's very inquisitive. It's great.
it's fabulous. It's such a treat to see our committee. We're back
You
to
know,
talk.
there's a bat in the Senate chamber.
Good, we like them. They're
Are
eating
you
the
a
mosquitoes.
bat person?
Oh.
So we'll,
Probably. I love bats.
I know.
So we're
Well, there's
running
one in the